Okay, guys, we are back with Jesus and Illustrating Life. We're going to end this today. We're in the third part, chapter 3, the story of the Passion. The Passover events in Jerusalem, the suffering, trial, crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus are what we're going to be covering. So this first piece of art, the cover page for this section that I'm going to show you, is the garden on the Mount of Olives. It's traditionally associated with Gethsemane, the place where Jesus was arrested. This is a photo. I don't see a credit. Let me see if there's no credit to this photo, unfortunately. It's not even it's not in any place where it normally has credit. That's unfortunate. Is it in the front? Illustration credits on page 96. Page 64 to 65. Okay, so this is by Bridgman Images, was the photo I just showed you. Okay, he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. Luke 22, verse 39. Okay, try to imagine for a moment the immense transformation of the city of Jerusalem on the eve of Passover almost 2,000 years ago, built to house around 50,000 inhabitants. It was suddenly flooded by tens of thousands of pilgrims, filling every nook and cranny of the sprawling town. Those who could afford it stayed at the inns and the hostelries of the upper and lower city, but most families went up to the Mount of Olives, where the poor could settle in for the night. Once on the hill, they would gingerly make their way through camps of hundreds of people, hoping to find a clean grassy patch or the welcome shade of an olive tree. At night, the hill teemed with the twinkling lights of campfires, while the air was full of the smells of cooking pots and the cries of children scampering among the groups of eating and sleeping adults. And in the morning, at dawn, all would have stood and watched as the sun slowly rose and bathed the temple with its golden light. This scene forms the stage for the dramatic climax of the gospel stories. Jesus' arrival in the temple, his angry outburst at the money changers, and his subsequent trial, arrest, and crucifixion. The exact sequence of events is difficult to determine because of discrepancies between the synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John. But perhaps the most trustworthy account is that of Mark, the oldest gospel, which some believe may have been based on a separate passion tradition known as the cross gospel. A further complicating factor for determining the timeline of these events in Jesus' life is that Judaism reckons day and night differently than our Western custom. In Jewish tradition, each new day starts at sunset rather than at midnight. A tentative consensus has emerged that the Passover events began on one of two dates: Friday, April 7th, in the year 30 CE, or Friday, April 3rd, if the events took place in the year 33 CE. Okay, so here is, so we have, I don't think I'm going to show you a picture yet. Okay, the temple disruption. Jesus evicts the money changers from the temple. It was the 14th day of the month of Nisan, the eve of Passover, a festival that celebrates Israel's release from Egypt. After the Israelites had been told to sacrifice a lamb and paint each door lintel with its blood, all these homes were passed over by the angel sent by God to slay Egypt's firstborn sons. Exodus 12, verse 6 to 7. Now, thousands of Jewish pilgrims converged on the temple to offer a lamb as a Passover sacrifice. Jesus and his disciples, too, left the house in Bethany and followed the large crowds into Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Roman forces in Jerusalem, stationed at the Antonia fortress, had been ordered on high alert. There had been several bloody riots since the death of King Herod. Passover was a particularly volatile time because it celebrated Israel's liberation from a despotic tyrant. The Egyptian pharaoh, it didn't take much to imagine the Roman emperor in exactly the same role. The rules for approving the sacrificial lambs were strict. They had to be male between 8 days and 1 year old and free of any physical blemish. Exodus 12, verse 5. Priests were posted at the temple gates to inspect the lambs and to reject any specimens found to have an injury or a blemish, no matter how small. For pilgrims who had traveled long distances, that was a major problem. The temple authorities recognized this. Therefore, they themselves offered such lambs for sale, guaranteed to pass priestly muster. Traditionally, this market was held on the Mount of Olives, but apparently the high priest Caiaphas had decided to bring this trade within the temple precinct itself. That introduced another complicating factor: to buy animals within the temple walls. Pilgrims couldn't use Roman or local currency, which sometimes carried the image of the emperor. They had to change their money into the only coin permitted at the temple, the Tyrian shekel. This meant that in addition to large pens holding lamps, the forecourt would also be filled with stands of money changers pitching their services. Jesus was not aware of this change, and so he was shocked to see this blatant commerce in the hallowed grounds of the temple forecourt. The cacophony of bleeding animals and the loud cries of money changers defeated his plan to deliver his sermon to the gathered pilgrims. His anger welled up, and he began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Mark 11, verse 15. As the bewildered traders scattered in all directions, Jesus stood up and cried, quoting the book of Isaiah, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you," he continued, looking at the priests in their white linen robes and tubular hats, "you have made it a den of thieves." Mark 11, verse 17. That last sentence was also a citation taken from Jeremiah's temple speech, Jeremiah 7, verse 11, but it sealed Jesus' fate. Okay, guys, so Jesus is not an angry person. We see him he is supposed to show us what it's like to be the perfect human. That is literally his role. And then he dies and sacrifices himself. If you paid attention to the Forgotten Books of Adam and Eve, which I'm reading right now, they should be in the Bible because it would have solved so many freaking things, so many freaking issues. It just makes me mad that it wasn't in there. So I personally think it should be. I think future leaders who are going to put all the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible, put them all in there. That is literally a historical document for us from people who put God first. Okay, I don't care if Jesus didn't mention it during his 3.5 years of ministry. I don't care your reasons for not including it. It should all be in the Bible. It is not up to you what goes and doesn't go in the Bible. It's up to God what goes and doesn't go in the Bible. So if he is releasing this information to us now, it needs to be in the freaking Bible. Enough said. Okay, so here is The Agony in the Garden by Venetian Renaissance artist Giovanni Bellini. Circa 1430 to 1516, was painted between 1459 and 1465. Okay. All right, then we have Jesus and the temple authorities. So I love that this is the first time because we've seen God get angry all through the Old Testament, but now we actually get to see Jesus angry. And he has reason to be angry. There is nothing. Texans believe that you are not allowed to express your anger, which I think is absolute fucking bullshit, guys. Anger is an emotion God gave us. God shows his anger. He shows his anger towards us numerous times. He shows his anger at sin, at the devil, numerous times. We are supposed to get angry at the devil, at sin, at bad things. We have become a part of a society now where we're it's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to express our emotion. It fucking is okay. If we're not fucking expressing our anger and emotion, you know what happens? Mental illness. Okay, Jesus and the temple authorities. Jesus may not have known this, but just 2 years earlier, the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, presumably in collusion with Caiaphas, was accused of illegally appropriating funds from the temple treasury, ostensibly to build a Roman aqueduct. Jesus' accusation, "You have made the temple a den of thieves," was therefore painfully close to the truth. As Mark writes, as soon as the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. Mark 11, verse 18. Silver temple shekels. Okay, so we have making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle, John 2, verse 15. And then we have, these are the silver temple shekels. And then we have the last one is opposite Christ driving the money. Changers from the temple is the work of Flemish artist Quentin Matsis from 1466 to 1530. This guy lived. It doesn't say when he made it. Okay, then we have the Last Supper. Jesus celebrates the Seder with his apostles. The sun's shadow was lengthening as Jesus and the apostles made their way through the narrow alleys of Jerusalem's lower city. Families were busy preparing for the Seder, the Passover meal. Jesus was staying in Bethany in the house of his close friends Mary and Martha, who would also be fully absorbed in the cooking. But Jesus decided to stay in Jerusalem for the time being, rather than return to Bethany. Perhaps the apostles feared that the gates and roads out of Jerusalem would be heavily patrolled by Roman soldiers and temple guards, which undoubtedly they were. In the meantime, however, they had no place where they could safely stay or share a meal themselves. Judas went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers of the temple police about how he might betray him to them. Luke 22, verse 4. Jesus asked two disciples to go and find a room. They were to follow a man with a jar of water, and when they saw him entering a house, they were supposed to say, "The teacher asks, 'Where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?'" Mark 14, verse 14. The two apostles followed Jesus' instructions and found everything as he had told them. Mark adds, they then prepared the Passover meal. Mark 14, verse 16. First, the lamb meat was roasted on skewers made of pomegranate wood. The meat was spiced with garlic cloves and repeatedly basted with honeyed olive oil. Cakes of unleavened bread were baked in another oven. While inside the house, experienced hands created several dishes of bitter herbs, such as parsley, mallows, chicory, and radishes. The purpose of these bitter herbs was to remind the Jews of their bitter time in Egypt. Wine was an integral part of the Passover meal. The Mishnah decrees that everyone, including the poor, should have no fewer than 4 cups of wine, even if the funds come from public charity, to allow everyone to share in the joy of Israel's release on Passover night. Jesus then revealed the most shocking news in all of the gospel stories, the discovery of a traitor in the very midst of Jesus' following. The story appears in all 4 gospels, which strongly argues for its authenticity, not least because it introduced a negative element of betrayal, which the evangelists would otherwise have been at pains to avoid. Jesus indicated that Judas was the traitor, Matthew 26, verse 25, who had promised to betray the location of Jesus to the chief priests in exchange for 30 pieces of silver, Matthew 26, verse 14 to 16. After Judas had left and the remaining disciples had recovered from the shock of what Jesus had told them, the disciples waited for Jesus to bless the food, a common Jewish practice at meals. Jesus took the bread, blessed it, and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then Jesus took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." Mark 14, verse 22 to 25. Okay, so with these words, Jesus instituted the quintessential Christian ritual of the Eucharist. Okay, so we have next piece of art is a modern depiction of the Last Supper from a church in Bamako, Mali. Okay, and then we have the week of unleavened bread. Mark's gospel tells us that Jesus was in Jerusalem on the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed. Mark 14, verse 12. During the Holy Week, observant Jews do not eat any bread made with leavened dough or consume any fermented grain products. The leaven is yeast, which in Jesus' time was the remains of old dough that had become fermented. Without it, bread would not rise in the oven. Instead, Jews eat a flatbread made from unleavened dough called matzo. Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. When Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, they had no time to let their bread rise before they escaped. So eating only unleavened bread at Passover commemorates their freedom from Egyptian slavery. Okay, For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, with it the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste. Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the arrest in Gethsemane. Jesus prays on the Mount of Olives. A familiar depiction of Jesus during the final hours before his arrest shows him alone, abandoned by his apostles, and surrounded by the pastoral stillness of the Mount of Olives. This long-standing iconography, established in the early Renaissance, became so ingrained that it's still featured in films and TV shows about the Passion. But the reality is quite different. As we saw previously, the majority of Passover pilgrims had neither the money or for an inn nor relatives in the city to spend the night with. Instead, they would congregate on the Mount of Olives, looking for a grassy patch in the shade of an olive tree. It was through this mass of humanity that Jesus and the apostles slowly made their way up the mountain, careful not to step on the bundles of sleeping men and women scattered along their path. It was dark and it was cold. Night temperatures in the middle of Nisan could fall as low as 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This is why Jesus, in search of a quiet place to reflect and pray, made his way to a place he must have visited before, Agat Shamanim, the root of the word Gethsemane. Agat Shamanim was an oil press used to crush olives from the orchards that gave the hill its name. It was usually set up in a cave so as to keep the oil cool in summer months and to protect the wooden press from the elements. Here, Jesus spent his final moments of freedom. Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. He prayed, remove this cup from me. But then he paused and added, yet not what I want, but what you want. Mark 14, verse 36. The instrument of this betrayal, Judas Iscariot, was at that moment picking his way through the thousands of eating and sleeping pilgrims on the mountain, closely followed by a detachment of temple guards. This was precisely the reason why the guards needed Judas to help identify their quarry among the multitudes. That crowded the Jerusalem hills. As soon as Judas saw Jesus near the Gethsemane cave, he rushed toward him and kissed him. Students habitually kiss their teacher as a sign of respect, but Judas turned his gesture of affection into a cynical one of betrayal. Spotting the signal, the guards moved in and arrested Jesus. Okay, so we have Christ on the Mount of Olives is an 1889 oil on canvas by the post-impressionist painter Paul Gauguin from 1848 to 1903. Then we have a view of the location traditionally believed to be the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. And this one again does not have the credit, so this is 74 to 75. Simon Norfolk, CO Institute for Artist Management, National Geographic Image Collection. Okay, so a theory that I'm coming up with. So if you're reading the Forgotten Books of Adam and Eve, which I have another YouTube on that, we're like going through and trying to figure, like, it has like very detailed directions on here of like where different things are located, where the cave of treasures is, where like all these, it's like literally like a map. So like a treasure map to the Garden of Eden. So like Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane like a lot. So like I need to try to figure out where that is in relation to Okay, I'm going to keep going, but I have ideas. Okay. The indictment by Caiaphas. The Sadducees debate the charges against Jesus. Custom dictated that after his arrest, Jesus should be interned in a prison near the temple to await his hearing by the full Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. This is exactly what happened when months later, Peter and John were arrested for the crime of blasphemy. They were held in custody at the temple until such time that Annas and Caiaphas could preside over a full session of the Sanhedrin. Acts 4, verse 6. But with Jesus, something strange happened. He was not taken to a prison cell, but instead was immediately dispatched with unseemly haste to the private residence of the high priest Caiaphas himself. As soon as he arrived there, he was instantly subjected to an indictment hearing. Why was Caiaphas in such a hurry to put Jesus away? The answer is that Caiaphas and his Sadducee brethren did not control the full Sanhedrin. A sizable and vocal minority of Pharisees on the council tended to go against Sadducee opinion. That is why Caiaphas decided to indict Jesus in secret in front of a few of his own handpicked Sadducee associates, the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. Mark 14, verse 53. Caiaphas' plan had one flaw. No high priest had the power to condemn a man to death on his own authority, without the backing of the full Sanhedrin, but Caiaphas had thought of that as well. He was going to let the occupying forces, the Romans, do it, provided he could steer the indictment from the religious to the political sphere. Are you the Messiah? He asked Jesus, the Son of the Blessed One. As a pious Sadducee, he did not pronounce the word God, but rather a euphemism, blessed one. Jesus replied, I am. And then he went on to quote the famous passage from Daniel that had inspired him throughout his ministry. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Mark 14, verse 61 to 62, quoting from Psalms 110, verse 1, and Daniel 7, verse 13 to 14. It was beautiful, rousing poetry, but Jesus had just spoken the words the high priest wanted to hear. Power coming from the clouds of heaven. Mark 14, verse 62 could be interpreted as political sedition, which enabled Caiaphas to transfer Jesus' case from the Jewish council to Roman jurisdiction, where he could be sentenced to death. Okay, so we have... Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. Matthew 26, verse 3. And then on this side, we have, then the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we still need witnesses? Mark 14, verse 63. So he's angry that he's not getting his way, basically, even though he did all this in secret and was nuts. Okay, Jesus before the high priest is a 16th century wall painting by Simeon Accenti in the Church of Archangel Michael in Galata, Cyprus. Okay, then we have He is Guilty of Death in 1906, painting by Russian artist Vasily Dmitrievich Polnov, 1844 to 1927. Okay, then we have the Danish classicist artist Karl Bloch, 1834 to 1890, painted Peter's Denial for the King's Chapel at Frederiksborg Castle, Hillerød, Denmark. Okay, Peter's Denial. Peter is accused as a follower of Jesus. Meanwhile, at a safe distance, Peter had followed the party that took Jesus to Caiaphas. Luke 22, verse 54. Like many of the chief priests, Caiaphas lived in a palatial residence in the upper city of Jerusalem. One such home was excavated by Israeli archaeologists in 1970. It featured a private suite of mikvayot, or ritual baths, a reception hall decorated with colorful frescoes, and a central courtyard. Peter now found himself in one such courtyard, surrounded by servants and guards. While inside the mansion, the hearing against Jesus was in progress. Peter was torn. On the one hand, he knew he should try to make his way inside and forcefully speak up in Jesus' defense. But on the other, he was afraid that by doing so, he would incriminate himself and most likely wind up being arrested as well. And so he hesitated, warming his hands at the fire in the courtyard. Luke 22, verse 55. As his face was lit by flames, one of the servant girls of Caiaphas looked at him more closely. You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth. Peter looked up, shock in his eyes. I do not know or understand what you are talking about. He stammered, his Galilean accent thick with fear, and quickly turned away, just as a cock began to crow. Mark 14, verse 67 to 68. The girl persisted. She turned to the others in the courtyard and said loudly, this man is one of them. Some of them, intrigued now, stepped closer and looked at Peter intently. Certainly, one said, you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. Peter hotly denied it and began to curse. think it's just supposed to be cursed. Somebody did not check that in editing. I do not know this man you are talking about, he cried. Mark 14, verse 69 to 71. At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. And Peter suddenly remembered what Jesus told him at the Last Supper. Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And then he broke down and wept. Mark 14, verse 72. He had failed in his greatest moment of need. Inside the mansion, the indictment was drawing to a close. Caiaphas was satisfied. The witnesses had very nearly botched the proceedings, but Jesus himself had spoken the words that Caiaphas knew would incriminate him in the eyes of Rome. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. All of them, says Mark, condemned him as deserving death. Mark 14, verse 63 to 64. Okay, so there is one drawing, no quotes for this one. Peter denies knowing Jesus for the 3rd time is an illustration from the 15th century Italian Codex de Pretis. Then we have the trial by Pilate, the Roman trial of Jesus. The trial by Pilate is perhaps the most controversial scene in the Gospels. Here, the evangelists confront the ultimate mystery of their story: who killed Jesus. Their task is to show that Jesus was the Messiah foretold in Hebrew Scripture, the Son of God, who had come to establish a kingdom of God on earth. But they also have to explain the fact that this same Jesus, this Messiah, was executed as an enemy of Rome. What's more, during the latter part of the 1st century, when the evangelists wrote their Gospels, many Jews in Roman Palestine and abroad rejected Jesus as a Messiah. As Paul had found during his missionary journeys, scores of Christian Jews even found themselves barred from synagogues. How then to reconcile these conflicting narratives? This was the essential dilemma that Mark faced, particularly because the majority of the earliest Christians in the Roman Empire were loyal to the Roman state. Mark's solution was to shift the blame from the Roman procurator to the Jewish crowds attending the trial. His scenario would also be adopted and further elaborated upon by Matthew, Luke, and John. We should note that Jesus did not merit a full Roman trial as a non-citizen. He could not claim the protection of the Roman ius civile. Instead, he was tried under the provision of a far more arbitrary law, the ius gentium, which applied to colonial subjects and gave its judges in overseas territories wide discretion. That is why Mark's description of a brief hearing presided over by Pontius Pilate is probably more accurate than the fully developed trial described in later Gospels. Mark notes that during the hearing, Jesus' accusers are the chief priests, the senior Sadducees leadership. In other words, Luke and Matthew expand this group to also include the leaders and the people. Luke 23, verse 13. By the time John writes his version near the end of the 1st century CE, he no longer makes any distinction whatsoever. Jesus' accusers, he says, are simply the Jews, John 19, verse 14 to 15. It is they who forced a reluctant Pilate to sentence Jesus to death by crucifixion. The instrument of this scenario is Pilate's decision, as told by Mark, to release a prisoner for them. Anyone for whom they asked, Mark 15, verse 6, Mark says this was Pilate's custom during festivals, but no reference to such an amnesty has been found in any Roman records of the time, nor in the accounts of Josephus, who would have seized on such a show of mercy to extol the benign character of Roman rule. Some scholars, however, have cautioned that a prefect like Pilate had wide latitude in dispensing justice, so the possibility of an amnesty would not be out of the question. When Pilate gave the crowd a choice between Barabbas, a convicted murderer, and Jesus, the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas. Despite Pilate's objections, the crowd shouted that Jesus should be condemned, and so Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15, verse 11 to 15, lest there be any lingering doubt about his complicity in the matter. Matthew shows him washing his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. Matthew 27, verse 24, unbeknownst to the evangelist, this argument that the Jewish community bore collective responsibility for the murder of Jesus would lay the seeds for centuries of Jewish persecution, from the massacres of the First Crusade to the anti-Semitism of the 19th century, and ultimately the unfathomable crime of the Holocaust. Okay, so we have a lot, guys. Okay, so we have, then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no basis for an accusation against this man. Luke 23, verse 4. And then we have Russian artist Nikolai G., 1831 to 1894, painted What is Truth? Christ and Pilate in 1890. So 4 years before he died, guys, he painted this. Then we have Swedish artist Anders Palsson, 1781 to 1849, depicted Christ before Pontius Pilate in 1818. This one. And then we have the flagellation of Christ. Okay, this is not yet, guys. Not yet. We're not doing this one yet. I have to read first. 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We're already at 30 minutes. I have 12 left. So this is either going to be really long. I think I'm just going to stop it here, actually, because this is already 30 minutes and I don't want people to get like, okay. So we're going to stop it here, guys. We'll pick up with the scourging. Jesus is flogged before his crucifixion next time, and then we'll finish the end of this magazine. Bye.